Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another spooky edition of Chapters Live. As always, I am Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, this month I have on my fabulous horns, and we are diving once again back into William Hope Hodgson's novella, The House on the Borderland. Now, as you remember from last week, this is an early example of cosmic horror. Last week, we started off with our narrator, who was with his friend in Ireland fishing, and while exploring one day, they happened to come across a giant chasm and ruins of an estate of some kind, and also a very strange book that they found buried. And the whole place just gave them the heebie jeebies. So they got back to their campsite and cracked open this buried manuscript, which was entitled The House on the Borderland. From there, we delve into the story of an old man living in an estate that was supposedly built by the devil, if you believe the townspeople, along with his elderly sister and his dog. And in the very beginning of the book, he has this vision or dream, he's not quite sure, where he rises up out of his chair and into space and is thrown into this strange red alien world where he comes across a house that looks like it's carved out of green jade and it looks identical to his house. But it's in this strange arena like area surrounded by all these motionless gods of old. And it's guarded by this monstrous swine like thing. Well, he returns to Earth or to wakefulness, whichever it is, and he goes out the next day to explore an area near his house that's known as the Pit. While there, his dog Pepper is attacked by a very monstrous, half human, half swine type thing that he cannot identify. He takes his dog back to his house to recover. While there, he catches another one spying in at his window and trying the door. And finally, that day, perhaps a few days later, he is attacked by several of them and just manages to get into the house and barricade the door. He spends the entire evening walking around, fending them off from the doors and the windows and such like. His sister completely faints. And when she comes to, doesn't seem to really recognize him, but seems to be afraid of him. And he can't quite figure that out. So, where we're picking up is with chapter 9. After all that's happened, this grand attack, these strange creatures, this weird dream, all this creepy stuff in this old weird house. We're picking back up with chapter 9 of The House on the Borderland. It's entitled In the Cellars. At last, what with being tired and cold and the uneasiness that possessed me, I resolved to take a walk through the house, first calling in at the study for a glass of brandy to warm me. This I did, and while there I examined the door carefully, but found all as I had left it the night before. The day was just breaking as I left the tower, though it was still too dark in the house to be able to see without a light, and I took one of the study candles with me on my round. By the time I had finished the ground floor, the daylight was creeping in, wanly, through the barred windows. My search had shown me nothing fresh. Everything appeared to be in order, and I was on the point of extinguishing my candle when the thought suggested itself to me to have another glance round the cellars. I had not, if I remember rightly, been into them since my hasty search on the evening of the attack. For, perhaps, the half of a minute I hesitated. I would have been very willing to forego the task, as indeed I am inclined to think any man well might, for of all the great, awe-inspiring rooms in this house, the cellars are the hugest and weirdest. Great, gloomy caverns of places, unlit by any ray of daylight. Yet I would not shirk the work. I felt that to do so would smack of sheer cowardice. Besides, as I reassured myself, the cellars were really the most unlikely places in which to come across anything dangerous, considering that they can be entered only through a heavy oaken door, the key of which I carry always on my person. It is in the smallest of these places that I keep my wine, a gloomy hole close to the foot of the cellar stairs, and beyond which I have seldom proceeded. Indeed, save for the rummage round already mentioned, I doubted whether I had ever before been right through the cellars. As I unlocked the great door at the top of the steps, I paused nervously a moment at the strange, desolate smell that assailed my nostrils. Then, throwing the barrel of my weapon forward, I descended slowly into the darkness of the underground regions. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, I stood for a minute and listened. All was silent save for a faint drip, drip of water falling, drop by drop, somewhere to my left. As I stood, I noticed how quietly the candle burnt, never a flicker nor flare, so utterly windless was the place. Quietly I moved from cellar to cellar. I had but a very dim memory of their arrangement. The impressions left by my first search were blurred. I had recollections of a succession of great cellars, and of one greater than the rest, the roof of which was upheld by pillars. Beyond that my mind was hazy, and predominated by a sense of cold and darkness and shadows. Now, however, it was different, for although nervous, I was sufficiently collected to be able to look about me and note the structure and size of the different vaults I entered. Of course, with the amount of light given by my candle, it was not possible to examine each place minutely, but I was enabled to notice as I went along that the walls appeared to be built with wonderful precision and finish, while here and there an occasional massive pillar shot up to support the vaulted roof. Thus I came at last to the great cellar that I remembered. It is reached through a huge arched entrance on which I observed strange, fantastic carvings which threw queer shadows under the light of my candle. As I stood and examined these thoughtfully, it occurred to me how strange it was that I should be so little acquainted with my own house. Yet this may be easily understood when one realizes the size of this ancient pile, and the fact that only my old sister and I live in it, occupying a few of the rooms such as our wants decide. Holding the light high, I passed on into the cellar, and, keeping to the right, paced slowly up until I reached the further end. I walked quietly and looked cautiously about as I went, but so far as the light showed, I saw nothing unusual. At the top, I turned to the left, still keeping to the wall, and so continued until I had traversed the whole of the vast chamber. As I moved along, I noticed that the floor was composed of solid rock, in places covered with a damp mold, in others bare or almost so, save for a thin coating of light gray dust. I had halted at the doorway. Now, however, I turned and made my way up the center of the place, passing among the pillars and glancing to right and left as I moved. About halfway up the cellar, I stubbed my top foot against something that gave out a metallic sound. Stooping quickly, I held the candle and saw that the object I had kicked was a large metal ring. Bending lower, I cleared the dust from around it, and presently discovered that it was attached to a ponderous trapdoor, black with age. Feeling excited and wondering to where it could lead, I laid my gun on the floor and, sticking the candle in the trigger guard, took the ring in both hands and pulled. The trap creaked loudly, the sound echoing vaguely through the huge place, and opened heavily. Propping the edge on my knee, I reached for the candle and held it in the opening, moving it to right and left, but could see nothing. I was puzzled and surprised. There were no signs of steps, or even the appearance of there ever having been any. Nothing, save an empty blankness. I might as well have been looking into a bottomless, sideless well. Then, even as I stared, full of perplexity, I seemed to hear, far down, as though from untold depths, a faint whisper of sound. I bent my head quickly more into the opening and listened intently. It may have been fancy, but I could have sworn to hearing a soft titter that grew into a hideous chuckling, faint and distant. Startled, I leapt backward, letting the trap fall with a hollow clang that filled the place with echoes. Even then I seemed to hear that mocking, suggestive laughter, but this, I knew, must be my imagination. The sound I had heard was far too slight to penetrate through the cumbrous trap. For a full minute I stood there, quivering, glancing nervously behind and before, but the great cellar was silent as a grave, and gradually I shook off the frightening sensation. With a calmer mind, I became again curious to know into what that trap opened, but could not then summon sufficient courage to make a further investigation. One thing I felt, however, was that the trap ought to be secured. This I accomplished by placing upon it several large pieces of dressed stone, which I had noticed in my tour along the east wall. Then, after a final scrutiny of the rest of the place, I retraced my way through the cellars to the stairs, and so reached the daylight, with an infinite feeling of relief that the uncomfortable task was accomplished. Chapter 10. The Time of Waiting. The sun was now warm and shining brightly, forming a wondrous contrast to the dark and dismal cellars, and it was with comparatively light feelings that I made my way up to the tower to survey the gardens. There I found everything quiet, and after a few minutes went down to Mary's room. Here, having knocked and received a reply, I unlocked the door. My sister was sitting quietly on the bed as though waiting. She seemed quite herself again, and made no attempt to move away as I approached, yet I observed that she scanned my face anxiously as though in doubt, and but half assured in her mind that there was nothing to fear from me. To my questions as to how she felt, she replied, sanely enough, that she was hungry and would like to go down to prepare breakfast if I did not mind. For a minute I meditated on whether it be safe to let her out. Finally, I told her she might go, on condition that she promised not to attempt to leave the house or meddle with any of the outer doors. At the mention of the doors, a sudden look of fright crossed her face, but she said nothing, save to give the required promise, and then left the room silently. Crossing the floor, I approached Pepper. He had waked as I entered, but, beyond a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft rapping with his tail, had kept quiet. Now, as I patted him, he made an attempt to stand up, and succeeded, only to fall back on his side with a little yowl of pain. I spoke to him and bade him lie still. I was greatly delighted with his improvement, and also with the natural kindness of my sister's heart, in taking such good care of him, in spite of her condition of mind. After a while I left him, and went downstairs to my study. In a little time Mary appeared, carrying a tray on which smoked a hot breakfast. As she entered the room, I saw her gaze fasten on the props that supported the study door. Her lips tightened, and I thought she paled slightly, but that was all. Putting the tray down at my elbow, she was leaving the room quietly when I called her back. She came, it seemed, a little timidly, as though startled, and I noted that her hand clutched at her apron nervously. "Come, Mary," I said, "cheer up. Things look brighter. I've seen none of the creatures since yesterday morning early." She looked at me in a curiously puzzled manner, as though not comprehending. Then intelligence swept into her eyes, and fear, but she said nothing beyond an unintelligible murmur of acquiescence. After that I kept silence. It was evident that any reference to the swine things was more than her shaken nerves could bear. Breakfast over, I went up to the tower. Here, during the greater part of the day, I maintained a strict watch over the gardens. Once or twice I went down to the basement to see how my sister was getting along. Each time I found her quiet and curiously submissive. Indeed, on the last occasion she even ventured to address me on her own account with regard to some household matter which needed attention. Though this was done with an almost extraordinary timidity, I hailed it with happiness as being the first word voluntarily spoken since the critical moment when I'd caught her unbarring the back door to go out among those waiting brutes. I wondered whether she was aware of her attempt and how near a thing it had been, but refrained from questioning her, thinking it best to let well alone. That night I slept in a bed, the first time for 2 nights. In the morning I rose early and took a walk through the house. All was as it should be, and I went up to the tower to have a look at the gardens. Here again I found perfect quietness. At breakfast, when I met Mary, I was greatly pleased to see that she had sufficiently regained command over herself to be able to greet me in a perfectly natural manner. She talked sensibly and quietly, only keeping carefully from any mention of the past couple days. In this I humored her, to the extent of not attempting to lead the conversation in that direction. Earlier in the morning I'd been to see Pepper. He was mending rapidly, and bade fair to be on his legs in earnest in another day or two. Before leaving the breakfast table I made some reference to his improvement. In the short discussion that followed, I was surprised to gather from my sister's remarks that she was still under the impression that his wound had been given by the wildcat of my invention. It made me almost ashamed of myself for deceiving her, yet the lie had been told to prevent her from being frightened. And then I had been sure that she must have known the truth later when those brutes had attacked the house. During the day I kept on the alert, spending much of my time, as on the previous day, in the tower, but not a sign could I see of the swine creatures, nor hear any sound. Several times the thought had come to me that the things had at last left us, but up to this time I had refused to entertain the idea seriously. Now, however, I began to feel that there was reason for hope. It would soon be 3 days since I'd seen any of the things, but still I intended to use the utmost caution. For all that I could tell, this protracted silence might be a ruse to tempt me from the house, perhaps right into their arms. The thought of such a contingency was alone sufficient to make me circumspect. So it was that the fourth, fifth, and sixth days went by quietly without my making any attempt to leave the house. On the sixth day I had the pleasure of seeing Pepper once more upon his feet, and though still very weak, he managed to keep me company during the whole of that day. Chapter 11. The Searching of the Gardens. How slowly the time went, and never a thing to indicate that any of the brutes still infested the gardens. It was on the ninth day that, finally, I decided to run the risk, if any there were, and sally out. With this purpose in view, I loaded one of the shotguns carefully, choosing it as being more deadly than a rifle at close quarters, and then, after a final scrutiny of the grounds from the tower, I called Pepper to follow me, and made my way down to the basement. At the door I must confess to hesitating a moment. The thought of what might be awaiting me among the dark shrubberies was by no means calculated to encourage my resolution. It was but a second, though, and then I had drawn the bolts and was standing on the path outside the door. Pepper followed, stopping at the doorstep to sniff suspiciously, and carrying his nose up and down the jambs as though following a scent. Then suddenly he turned sharply and started to run here and there in semicircles and circles, all around the door, finally returning to the threshold. Here he began again to nose about. Hitherto I had stood watching the dog, yet all the time with half my gaze on the wild tangle of gardens stretching round me. Now I went toward him, and bending down, examined the surface of the door where he was smelling. I found that the wood was covered in a network of scratches, crossing and recrossing one another in inextricable confusion. In addition to this, I noticed that the doorposts themselves were gnawed in places. Beyond these I could find nothing, and so, standing up, I began to make the tour of the house wall. Pepper, as soon as I walked away, left the door and ran ahead, still nosing and sniffing as he went along. At times he stopped to investigate. Here it would be a bullet hole in the pathway, or perhaps a powder-stained wad. Anon it might be a piece of torn sod, or a disturbed patch of weedy path. But, save for such trifles, he found nothing. I observed him critically as he went along, and could discover nothing about uneasiness in his demeanor to indicate that he felt the nearness of any of the creatures. By this I was assured that the gardens were empty, at least for the present, of those hateful things. Pepper could not be easily deceived, and it was a relief to feel that he would know and give me timely warning if there were any danger. Reaching the place where I had shot the first creature, I stopped and made a careful scrutiny, but could see nothing. From there I went on to where the great coping stone had fallen. It lay on its side, apparently just as it had been left when I shot the brute that was moving it. A couple of feet to the right of the nearer end was a great dent in the ground, showing where it had struck. The other end was still within the indentation, half in, half out. Going nearer, I looked at the stone more closely. What a huge piece of masonry it was, and that creature had moved it single-handed in its attempt to reach what lay below. I went round to the further end of the stone. Here I found that it was possible to see under it for a distance of nearly a couple of feet. Still, I could see nothing of the stricken creatures, and I felt much surprised. I had, as I have before said, guessed that the remains had been removed, yet I could not conceive that it had been done so thoroughly as to not leave some certain sign beneath the stone indicative of their fate. I had seen several of the brutes struck down beneath it with such force that they must have been literally driven into the earth, and now not a vestige of them was to be seen, not even a blood stain. I felt more puzzled than ever as I turned the matter over in my mind, but could think of no plausible explanation, and so finally gave it up as one of the many things that were unexplainable. From there I transferred my attention to the study door. I could see now even more plainly the effects of the tremendous strain to which it had been subjected, and I marveled how, even with the support afforded by the props, it had withstood the attack so well. There were no marks of blows, indeed none had been given, but the door had been literally riven from its hinges by the application of enormous silent force. One thing that I observed affected me profoundly. The head of one of the props had been driven right through a panel. This was of itself sufficient to show how huge an effort the creatures had made to break down the door, and how nearly they had succeeded. Leaving, I continued my tour round the house, finding little else of interest save at the back, where I came across the piece of piping I had torn from the wall, lying among the long grass underneath the broken window. Then I returned to the house, and having rebolted the back door, went up to the tower. Here I spent the afternoon reading and occasionally glancing down into the gardens. I had determined, if the night passed quietly, to go as far as the pit on the morrow. Perhaps I should be able to learn then something of what had happened. The day slipped away, and the night came, and went much as the last few nights had gone. When I rose, the morning had broken, fine and clear, and I determined to put my project into action. During breakfast, I considered the matter carefully, after which I went to the study for my shotgun. In addition, I loaded and slipped into my pocket a small but heavy pistol. I quite understood that, if there were any danger, it lay in the direction of the pit, and I intended to be prepared. Leaving the study, I went down to the back door, followed by Pepper. Once outside, I took a quick survey of the surrounding gardens and then set off towards the pit. On the way, I kept a sharp lookout, holding my gun handily. Pepper was running ahead, I noticed, without any apparent hesitation. From this, I argued that there was no imminent danger to be apprehended, and I stepped out more quickly in his wake. He had reached the top of the pit now, and was nosing his way along the edge. A minute later, I was beside him, looking down into the pit. For a moment, I could scarcely believe that it was the same place, so greatly was it changed. The dark wooded ravine of a fortnight ago, with a foliage-hidden stream running sluggishly at the bottom, existed no longer. Instead, my eyes showed me a ragged chasm, partly filled with a gloomy lake of turbid water. All but one side of the ravine was stripped of underwood, showing the bare rock. A little to my left, the side of the pit appeared to have collapsed altogether, forming a deep V-shaped cleft in the face of the rocky cliff. This rift ran from the upper edge of the ravine nearly down to the water, and was penetrated into the pit side, to a distance of some 40 feet. Its opening was at least 6 yards across, and from this it seemed to taper into about 2. But what attracted my attention more than even the stupendous split itself was a great hole, some distance down the cleft, and right in the angle of the V. It was clearly defined, and not unlike an arched doorway in shape, though, lying as it did in the shadow, I could not see it very distinctly. The opposite side of the pit still retained its verdure, but so torn in places, and everywhere covered with dust and rubbish, that it was hardly distinguishable as such. My first impression that there had been a landslip was, I began to see, not sufficient of itself to account for all the changes that I had witnessed. And the water? I turned suddenly, for I had become aware that somewhere to my right there was a noise of running water. I could see nothing, but, now that my attention had been caught, I distinguished easily that it came from somewhere at the east end of the pit. Slowly I made my way in that direction, the sound growing plainer as I advanced, until, in a little, I stood right above it. Even then I could not perceive the cause until I knelt down and thrust my head over the cliff. Here the noise came up to me plainly, and I saw below me a torrent of clear water, issuing from a small fissure in the pit side, and rushing down the rocks into the lake beneath. A little further along the cliff I saw another, and beyond that again 2 smaller ones. These, then, would help to account for the quantity of water in the pit, and as the fall of rock and earth had blocked the outlet of the stream at the bottom, there was little doubt but that it had contributed a very large share. Yet I puzzled my head to account for the generally shaken appearance of the place, these streamlets, and that huge cleft further up the ravine. It seemed to me that more than the landslip was necessary to account for these. I could imagine an earthquake or a great explosion creating some such condition of affairs as existed, but of these there had been neither. Then I stood up quickly, remembering that crash and the cloud of dust that had followed, directly rushing high into the air. But I shook my head unbelievingly. No, it must have been the noise of the falling rocks and earth I had heard. Of course, the dust would fly naturally. Still, in spite of my reasoning, I had an uneasy feeling that this theory did not satisfy my sense of the probable, and yet was any other that I could suggest likely to be half so plausible? Pepper had been sitting on the grass while I conducted my examination. Now, as I turned up the north side of the ravine, he rose and followed. Slowly, and keeping a careful watch in all directions, I made the circuit of the pit, but found little else that I had not already seen. From the west end I could see the 4 waterfalls uninterruptedly. They were some considerable distance up from the surface of the lake, about 50 feet, I calculated. For a little while longer I loitered about, keeping my eyes and ears open, but still without seeing or hearing anything suspicious. The whole place was wonderfully quiet. Indeed, save for the continuous murmur of the water at the top end, no sound of any description broke the silence. All this while Pepper had shown no signs of uneasiness. This seemed to me to indicate that, for the time being at least, there was none of the swine creatures in the vicinity. So far as I could see, his attention appeared to have been taken chiefly with scratching and sniffing along the grass at the edge of the pit. At times he would leave the edge and run along toward the house as though following invisible tracks, but in all cases returning after a few minutes. I had little doubt that he was really tracing out the footsteps of the swine things, and the very fact that each one seemed to lead him back to the pit appeared to me a proof that the brutes had all returned whence they came. At noon I went home for dinner. During the afternoon I made a partial search of the gardens, accompanied by Pepper, but without coming upon anything to indicate the presence of the creatures. Once, as we made our way through the shrubberies, Pepper rushed in among some bushes with a fierce yelp. At that I jumped back in sudden fright and threw my gun forward in readiness, only to laugh nervously as Pepper reappeared chasing an unfortunate cat. Toward evening I gave up the search and returned to the house. All at once, as we were passing a great clump of bushes on our right, Pepper disappeared, and I could hear him sniffing and growling among them in a suspicious manner. With my gun barrel I parted the intervening shrubbery and looked inside. There was nothing to be seen, save that many of the branches were bent down and broken, as though some animal had made a lair there at no very previous date. It was probably, I thought, one of the places occupied by some of the swine creatures on the night of the attack. Next day I resumed my search through the gardens, but without result. By evening I had been right through them, and now I knew, beyond the possibility of doubt, that there were no longer any of the things concealed about the place. Indeed, I have often thought since that I was correct in my earlier surmise that they had left soon after the attack. Chapter 12. The Subterranean Pit. Another week came and went, during which I spent a great deal of my time about the pit mouth. I had come to the conclusion a few days earlier that the arched hole in the angle of the great rift was the place through which the swine things had made their exit from some unholy place in the bowels of the world. How near the probable truth this went, I was to learn later. It may be easily understood that I was tremendously curious, though in a frightened way, to know to what infernal place that hole led, though so far the idea had not struck me seriously of making an investigation. I was far too much imbued with a sense of horror of the swine creatures to think of venturing willingly where there was any chance of coming into contact with them. Gradually, however, as time passed, this feeling grew insensibly less, so that when, a few days later, the thought occurred to me that it might be possible to clamber down and have a look into the hole, I was not so exceedingly averse to it as might have been imagined. Still, I do not think, even then, that I really intended to try any such foolhardy adventure. For all that I could tell, it might be certain death to enter that doleful-looking opening. And yet, such is the pertinacity of human curiosity that, at last, my chief desire was but to discover what lay beyond that gloomy entrance. Slowly, as the days slid by, my fear of the swine things became an emotion of the past, more an unpleasant, incredible memory than aught else. Thus, a day came when, throwing thoughts and fancies adrift, I procured a rope from the house, and having made it fast to a stout tree at the top of the rift, and some little distance back from the pit edge, let the other end down into the cleft until it dangled right across the mouth of the dark hole. Then, cautiously and with many misgivings as to whether it was not a mad act that I was attempting, I climbed slowly down, using the rope as a support, until I reached the hole. Here, still holding on to the rope, I stood and peered in. All was perfectly dark, and not a sound came to me. Yet, a moment later, it seemed that I could hear something. I held my breath and listened, but all was silent as the grave, and I breathed freely once more. In the same instant I heard the sound again. It was like a noise of labored breathing, deep and sharp drawn. For a short second I stood petrified, not being able to move. But now the sounds had ceased again, and I could hear nothing. As I stood there anxiously, my foot dislodged a pebble which fell inward into the dark with a hollow clink. At once the noise was taken up and repeated a score of times, each succeeding echo being fainter and seeming to travel away from me, as though into remote distance. Then, as the silence fell again, I heard that stealthy breathing. For each respiration I made, I could hear an answering breath. The sounds appeared to be coming nearer, and then I heard several others, but fainter and more distant. Why I did not grip the rope and spring up out of danger, I cannot say. It was as though I had been paralyzed. I broke out into a profuse sweat and tried to moisten my lips with my tongue. My throat had gone suddenly dry, and I coughed huskily. It came back to me in a dozen horrible, throaty tones, mockingly. I peered helplessly into the gloom, but still nothing showed. I had a strange choky sensation, and again I coughed dryly. Again the echo took it up, rising and falling grotesquely, and dying slowly into a muffled silence. Then suddenly a thought came to me, and I held my breath. The other breathing stopped. I breathed again, and once more it recommenced. But now I no longer feared. I knew that the strange sounds were not by any lurking swine creature, but were simply the echo of my own respirations. Yet I had received such a fright that I was glad to scramble up the rift and haul up the rope. I was far too shaken and nervous to think of entering that dark hole then, and so returned to the house. I felt more myself next morning, but even then I could not summon up sufficient courage to explore the place. All this time the water in the pit had been creeping slowly up, and now stood but a little below the opening. At the rate at which it was rising, it would be level with the floor in less than another week, and I realized that, unless I carried out my investigation soon, I should probably never do so at all, as the water would rise and rise until the opening itself was submerged. It may have been that this thought stirred me to act, but whatever it was, a couple of days later saw me standing at the top of the cleft, fully equipped for the task. This time I was resolved to conquer my shirking and go right through with the matter. With this intention, I had brought, in addition to the rope, a bundle of candles, meaning to use them as a torch, also my double-barreled shotgun. In my belt, I had a heavy horse pistol loaded with buckshot. As before, I fastened the rope to the tree. Then, having tied my gun across my shoulders with a piece of stout cord, I lowered myself over the edge of the pit. At this movement, Pepper, who had been eyeing my actions watchfully, rose to his feet and ran to me with a half bark, half wail, it seemed to me, of warning. But I was resolved in my enterprise and bade him lie down. I would much have liked to take him with me, but this was next to impossible in the existing circumstances. As my face dropped level with the pit edge, he licked me right across the mouth, and then, seizing my sleeve between his teeth, began to pull back strongly. It was very evident that he did not want me to go. Yet, having made up my mind, I had no intention of giving up the attempt, and with a sharp word to Pepper to release me, I continued my descent, leaving the poor old fellow at the top, barking and crying like a forsaken pup. Carefully I lowered myself from projection to projection. I knew that a slip might mean a wetting. Reaching the entrance, I let go of the rope and untied the gun from my shoulders. Then, with a last look at the sky, which I noticed was clouding over rapidly, I went forward a couple of paces so as to be shielded from the wind, and lit one of the candles. Holding it above my head and grasping my gun firmly, I began to move on slowly, throwing my glances in all directions. For the first minute I could hear the melancholy sound of Pepper's howling coming down to me. Gradually, as I penetrated further into the blackness, it grew fainter until, in a little while, I could hear nothing. The path tended downward somewhat and to the left. Thence it kept on, still running to the left, until I found that it was leading me right in the direction of the house. Very cautiously I moved onward, stopping every few steps to listen. I had gone perhaps 100 yards when suddenly it seemed to me that I caught a faint sound somewhere along the passage behind. With my heart thudding heavily, I listened. The noise grew plainer and appeared to be approaching rapidly. I could hear it distinctly now. It was the soft padding of running feet. In the first moments of fright, I stood irresolute, not knowing whether to go forward or backward. Then, with a sudden realization of the best thing to do, I backed up to the rocky wall on my right, and, holding the candle above my head, waited, gun in hand, cursing my foolhardy curiosity for bringing me into such a strait. I had not long to wait, but a few seconds, before two eyes reflected back from the gloom the rays of my candle. I raised my gun, using my right hand only, and aimed quickly. Even as I did so, something leapt out of the darkness with a blustering bark of joy that woke the echoes like thunder. It was Pepper. How he had contrived to scramble down the cleft I could not conceive. As I brushed my hand nervously over his coat, I noticed that he was dripping, and concluded that he must have tried to follow me and fallen into the water, from which he would not have found it very difficult to climb. Having waited a minute or so to steady myself, I proceeded along the way, Pepper following quietly. I was curiously glad to have the old fellow with me. He was company, and somehow, with him at my heels, I was less afraid. Also, I knew how quickly his keen ears would detect the presence of any unwelcome creature, should there be such, amid the darkness that wrapped us. For some minutes we went slowly along, the path still leading straight toward the house. Soon, I concluded, we should be standing right beneath it, did the path but carry far enough. I led the way cautiously for another 50 yards or so. Then I stopped and held the light high, and reason enough I had to be thankful that I did so, for there, not 3 paces forward, the path vanished, and in place showed a hollow blackness that sent sudden fear through me. Very cautiously I crept forward and peered down, but could see nothing. Then I crossed to the left of the passage to see whether there might be any continuation of the path. Here, right against the wall, I found that a narrow track some 3 feet wide led onward. Carefully I stepped onto it, but I had not gone far before I regretted venturing thereon, for after a few paces the already narrow way resolved itself into a mere ledge, with on the one side the solid, unyielding rock towering up in a great wall to the unseen roof, and on the other that yawning chasm. I could not help reflecting how helpless I was should I be attacked there, with no room to turn, and where even the recoil of my weapon might be sufficient to drive me headlong into the depths below. To my great relief, a little further on, the track suddenly broadened out again to its original breadth. Gradually, as I went onward, I noticed that the path trended steadily to the right, and so, after some minutes, I discovered that I was not going forward, but merely circling the huge abyss. I had evidently come to the end of the great passage. 5 minutes later, I stood on the spot from where I had started, having been completely round what I guessed now to be a vast pit, the mouth of which must be at least 100 yards across. For some little time I stood there, lost in perplexing thought. What does it all mean? Was the cry that had begun to reiterate through my brain. A sudden idea struck me, and I searched round for a piece of stone. Presently I found a bit of rock about the size of a small loaf. Sticking the candle upright in a crevice on the floor, I went back from the edge somewhat, and taking a short run, launched the stone forward into the chasm, my idea being to throw it far enough to keep it clear of the sides. Then I stooped forward and listened, but though I kept perfectly quiet, for at least a full minute, no sound came back to me from out of the dark. I knew then that the depth of the hole must be immense, for the stone, had it struck anything, was large enough to have set the echoes of that weird place whispering for an indefinite period. Even as it was, the cavern had given back the sounds of my footfalls multitudinously. The place was awesome, and I would have willingly have retraced my steps, and left the mysteries of its solitude unsolved. Only to do so meant admitting defeat. Then a thought came to try to get a view of the abyss. It occurred to me that if I placed my candles round the edge of the hole, I should be able to get at least some dim sight of the place. I found, on counting, that I had brought 15 candles in the bunch, my first intention having been, as I have already said, to make a torch of the lot. These I proceeded to place round the pit mouth, with an interval of about 20 yards in between each. Having completed the circle, I stood in the passage, and endeavored to get an idea of how the place looked. But I discovered immediately that they were totally insufficient for my purpose. They did little more than make the gloom visible. One thing they did, however, and that was, they confirmed my opinion of the size of the opening, and although they showed me nothing that I wanted to see, yet the contrast they afforded to the heavy darkness pleased me curiously. It was as though 15 tiny stars shone through the subterranean night. Then, even as I stood, Pepper gave a sudden howl that was taken up by the echoes and repeated with ghastly variations, dying away slowly. With a quick movement, I held aloft the one candle I had kept, and glanced down at the dog. At the same moment, I seemed to hear a noise, like a diabolical chuckle, rise up from the hitherto silent depths of the pit. I started. Then I recollected that it was probably the echo of Pepper's howl. Pepper had moved away from me, up the passage a few steps. He was nosing along the rocky floor, and I thought I heard him lapping. I went toward him, holding the candle low. As I moved, I heard my boot go sop, sop, and the light was reflected from something that glistened and crept past my feet swiftly toward the pit. I bent lower and looked, then gave vent to an expression of surprise. From somewhere higher up the path, a stream of water was running quickly in the direction of the great opening, and growing in size every second. Again Pepper gave vent to that deep-drawn howl, and running at me, seized my coat, and attempted to drag me up the path toward the entrance. With a nervous gesture I shook him off and crossed quickly over to the left-hand wall. If anything were coming, I was going to have the wall at my back. Then, as I stared anxiously up the pathway, my candle caught a gleam far up the passage. At the same moment I became conscious of a murmurous roar that grew louder and filled the whole cavern with deafening sound. From the pit came a deep, hollow echo like the sob of a giant. Then I had sprung to one side onto the narrow ledge that ran round the abyss, and turning saw a great wall of foam sweep past me and leap tumultuously into the waiting chasm. A cloud of spray burst over me, extinguishing my candle and wetting me to the skin. I still held my gun. The three nearest candles went out, but the further ones gave only a short flicker. After the first rush, the flow of water eased down to a steady stream, maybe a foot in depth, though I could not see this till I had procured one of the lighted candles, and with it started to reconnoiter. Pepper had, fortunately, followed me as I leapt for the ledge, and now very much subdued, kept close behind. A short examination showed me that the water reached right across the passage and was running at a tremendous rate. Already, even as I stood there, it had deepened. I could make only a guess as to what had happened. Evidently, the water in the ravine had broken into the passage by some means. If that were the case, it would go on increasing in volume until I should find it impossible to leave the place. The thought was frightening. It was evident that I must make my exit as hurriedly as possible. Taking my gun by the stock, I sounded the water. It was a little under knee-deep. The noise it made, plunging down into the pit, was deafening. Then, with a call to Pepper, I stepped out into the flood, using the gun as a staff. Instantly, the water boiled up over my knees and nearly to the tops of my thighs, with the speed at which it was racing. For one short moment, I nearly lost my footing, but the thought of what lay behind stimulated me to a fierce endeavor, and step by step I made headway. Of Pepper I knew nothing at first. I had all I could do to keep on my legs, and was overjoyed when he appeared beside me. He was wading manfully along. He is a big dog with longish, thin legs, and I suppose the water had less grasp on them than upon mine. Anyway, he managed a great deal better than I did, going ahead of me like a guide, and wittingly, or otherwise, helping somewhat to break the force of the water. On we went, step by step, struggling and gasping until somewhere about 100 yards had been safely traversed. Then, whether it was because I was taking less care or that there was a slippery place on the rocky floor, I cannot say, but suddenly I slipped and fell on my face. Instantly the water leapt over me in a cataract, hurling me down toward that bottomless hole at frightful speed. Frantically I struggled, but it was impossible to get a footing. I was helpless, gasping, and drowning. All at once something gripped my coat and brought me to a standstill. It was Pepper. Missing me, he must have raced back through the dark turmoil to find me, and then caught and held me until I was able to get back on my feet. I have a dim recollection of having seen, momentarily, the gleams of several lights, but of this I have never been quite sure. If my impressions are correct, I must have been washed down to the very brink of that awful chasm before Pepper managed to bring me to a standstill. And the lights, of course, could only have been the distant flames of the candles I'd left burning. But, as I have said, I am not by my means sure. My eyes were full of water, and I had been badly shaken. And there I was, without my helpful gun, without light, and sadly confused, with the water deepening, depending solely upon my old friend Pepper to help me out of that hellish place. I was facing the torrent. Naturally, it was the only way in which I could have sustained my position a moment, for even old Pepper could not have held me long against that terrific strain, without assistance, however blind, from me. Perhaps a minute passed, during which it was touch and go with me. Then, gradually, I recommenced my tortuous way up the passage. And so began the grimmest fight with death, from which ever I hoped to emerge victorious. Slowly, furiously, almost hopelessly I strove, and that faithful Pepper led me, dragged me, upward and onward, until at last, ahead, I saw a gleam of blessed light. was the entrance. Only a few yards further, and I reached the opening with the water surging and boiling hungrily around my loins. And now I understood the cause of the catastrophe. It was raining heavily, literally in torrents. The surface of the lake was level with the bottom of the opening, nay, more than level, it was above it. Evidently, the rain had swollen the lake and caused this premature rise, for, at the rate the ravine had been filling, would not have reached the entrance for a couple more days. Luckily, the rope by which I had descended was streaming into the opening upon the inrushing waters. Seizing the end, I knotted it securely round Pepper's body, then, summoning up the last remnant of my strength, I commenced to swarm up the side of the cliff. I reached the pit edge in the last stage of exhaustion, yet I had to make one last effort and haul Pepper into safety. Slowly and wearily I hauled on the rope. Once or twice it seemed that I should have to give up. Poor Pepper is a weighty dog, and I was utterly done. Yet to let go would have meant certain death to the old fellow, and the thought spurred me to greater exertions. I have but a very hazy remembrance of the end. I remember pulling through moments that lagged strangely. I also have some recollection of seeing Pepper's muzzle appearing over the pit edge after what seemed an indefinite period of time. Then all grew suddenly dark. Chapter 13. The Trap in the Great Cellar. I suppose I must have swooned, for the next thing I remember I opened my eyes and all was dusk. I was lying on my back with one leg doubled under the other, and Pepper was licking my ears. I felt horribly stiff, and my leg was numb from the knee downward. For a few minutes I lay thus, in a dazed condition. Then, slowly, I struggled to a sitting position and looked about me. It had stopped raining, but the trees still dripped dismally. From the pit came a continuous murmur of running water. I felt cold and shivery. My clothes were sodden, and I ached all over. Very slowly the life came back into my numbed leg, and after a little I essayed to stand up. This I managed at the second attempt, but I was very tottery and peculiarly weak. It seemed to me that I was going to be ill, and I made shift to stumble my way toward the house. My steps were erratic and my head confused. At each step that I took, sharp pain shot through my limbs. I had gone perhaps some 30 paces when a cry from Pepper drew my attention, and I turned stiffly toward him. The old dog was trying to follow me, but could come no further owing to the rope with which I had hauled him up being still tied round his body, the other end having not been unfastened from the tree. For a moment I fumbled with the knots weakly, but they were wet and hard, and I could do nothing. Then I remembered my knife, and in a minute the rope was cut. How I reached the house I scarcely know, and of the days that followed I remember still less. Of one thing I am certain, that, had it not been for my sister's untiring love and nursing, I had not been writing at this moment. When I recovered my senses, it was to find out that I had been in bed for nearly 2 weeks. Yet another week passed before I was strong enough to totter out into the gardens. Even then I was not able to walk so far as the pit. I would have liked to ask my sister how high the water had risen, but felt it was wiser not to mention the subject to her. Indeed, since then I have made a rule never to speak to her about the strange things that happen in this great old house. It was not until a couple days later that I managed to get across to the pit. There I found in my few weeks' absence there had been wrought a wondrous change. Instead of the 3 parts filled ravine, I looked out upon a great lake, whose placid surface reflected the light coldly. The water had risen to within half a dozen feet of the pit edge. Only in one part was the lake disturbed, and that was above the place where, far down under the silent waters, yawned the entrance to the vast underground pit. Here there was a continuous bubbling, and occasionally a curious sort of sobbing gurgle would find its way up from the depth. Beyond these, there was nothing to tell the things that were hidden beneath. As I stood there, it came to me how wonderfully things had worked out. The entrance to the place whence the swine creatures had come was sealed up by a power that made me feel there was nothing more to fear from them. And yet, with the feeling, there was a sensation that now I should never learn anything further of the place from which these dreadful things had come. It was completely shut off and concealed from human curiosity forever. Strange! In the knowledge of that underground hellhole, how opposite had been the naming of the pit. One wonders how it originated and when. Naturally, one concludes that the shape and depth of the ravine would suggest the name pit. Yet Is it not possible that it has, all along, held a deeper significance, a hint, could one but have guessed, of the greater, more stupendous pit that lies far down in the earth beneath this old house? Under this house! Even now the idea is strange and terrible to me, for I have proved beyond doubt that the pit yawns right below the house, which is evidently supported, somewhere above the center of it, upon a tremendous arched roof of solid rock. It happened in this wise, that, having occasion to go down to the cellars, the thought occurred to me to pay a visit to the great vault, where the trap is situated, and see whether everything was as I had left it. Reaching the place, I walked slowly up the center, until I came to the trap. There it was, with the stones piled upon it, just as I had seen it last. I had a lantern with me, and the idea came to me that now would be a good time to investigate whatever lay under the great oak slab. Placing the lantern on the floor, I tumbled the stones off the trap, and, grasping the ring, pulled the door open. As I did so, the cellar became filled with the sound of a murmurous thunder that rose from far below. At the same time, a damp wind blew up into my face, bringing with it a load of fine spray. Therewith I dropped the trap hurriedly, with a half-frightened feeling of wonder. For a moment I stood puzzled. I was not particularly afraid. The haunting fear of the swine things had left me long ago, but I was certainly nervous and astonished. Then a sudden thought possessed me, and I raised the ponderous door with a feeling of excitement. Leaving it standing upon its end, I seized the lantern and, kneeling down, thrust it into the opening. As I did so, the moist wind and spray drove in my eyes, making me unable to see for a few moments. Even when my eyes were clear, I could distinguish nothing below me save darkness and whirling spray. Seeing that it was useless to expect to make out anything, with the light so high, I felt in my pockets for a piece of twine with which to lower it further into the opening. Even as I fumbled, the lantern slipped from my fingers and hurled down into the darkness. For a brief instant I watched its fall, and saw the light shine on a tumult of white foam some 80 or 100 feet below me. Then it was gone. My sudden surmise was correct, and now I knew the cause of the wet and noise. The great cellar was connected with the pit by means of the trap, which opened right above it, and the moisture was the spray rising from the water falling into the depths. In an instant I had an explanation of certain things that had hitherto puzzled me. Now I could understand why the noises on the first night of the invasion had seemed to rise directly from under my feet, and the chuckle that had sounded when first I opened the trap. Evidently some of the swine things must have been right beneath me. Another thought struck me. Were the creatures all drowned? Would they drown? I remembered how unable I had been to find any traces to show that my shooting had really been fatal. Had they life as we understand life, or were they ghouls? These thoughts flashed through my brain as I stood in the dark, searching my pockets for matches. I had the box in my hand now, and striking a light, I stepped to the trap door and closed it. Then I piled the stones back upon it, after which I made my way out from the cellars. And so, I suppose, the water goes on, thundering down into that bottomless hell pit. Sometimes I have an inexplicable desire to go down to the great cellar, open the trap, and gaze into the impenetrable, spray-damp darkness. At times the desire becomes almost overpowering in its intensity. It is not mere curiosity that prompts me, but more as though some unexplained influence were at work. Still, I never go, and intend to fight down the strange longing and crush it, even as I would the unholy thought of self-destruction. This idea of some intangible force being exerted may seem reasonless, yet my instinct warns me that it is not so. In these things, reason seems to me less to be trusted than instinct. One thought there is, in closing, that impresses itself upon me with ever-growing insistence. It is that I live in a very strange house, a very awful house, and I've begun to wonder whether I'm doing wisely in staying here. Yet, if I left, where could I go and still obtain the solitude and the sense of her presence that alone make my old life bearable? Chapter 14. The Sea of Sleep. For a considerable period after the last incident which I have narrated in my diary, I had serious thoughts of leaving this house, and might have done so but for the great and wonderful thing of which I am about to write. How well I was advised in my heart when I stayed on here, spite of those visions and sights of unknown and unexplainable things. For, had I not stayed, then I had not again seen the face of her I loved. Yes, though few know it, none now save my sister Mary, I have loved and, ah me, lost. I would write down the story of those sweet old days, but it would be like the tearing of old wounds. Yet, after that which has happened, what need have I to care? For she has come to me out of the unknown. Strangely, she warned me passionately against this house, begged me to leave it, but admitted, when I questioned her, that she could not have come to me had I been elsewhere. Yet, in spite of this, still she warned me earnestly, telling me that it was a place long ago given over to evil, and under the power of grim laws, of which none here have knowledge. And I just asked her again whether she would come to me elsewhere, and she could only stand silent. It was thus that I came to the place of the Sea of Sleep, so she termed it in her dear speech to me. I had stayed up in my study, reading, and must have dozed over the book. Suddenly I awoke and sat upright with a start. For a moment I looked round with a puzzled sense of something unusual. There was a misty look about the room, giving a curious softness to each table and chair and furnishing. Gradually the mistiness increased, growing, as it were, out of nothing. Then, slowly, a soft white light began to glow in the room. The flames of the candle shone through it palely. I looked from side to side and found that I could still see each piece of furniture, but in a strangely unreal way, more as though the ghost of each table and chair had taken the place of the solid article. Gradually, as I looked, I saw them fade and fade until slowly they resolved into nothingness. Now I looked again at the candles. They shone wanly, and even as I watched, grew more unreal, and so vanished. The room was filled now with a soft yet luminous white twilight, like a gentle mist of light. Beyond this I could see nothing. Even the walls had vanished. Presently I became conscious that a faint continuous sound pulsed through the silence that wrapped me. I listened intently. It grew more distinct until it appeared to me that I harked to the breathings of some great sea. I cannot tell how long a space passed thus, but after a while it seemed that I could see through the mistiness, and slowly I became aware that I was standing upon the shore of an immense and silent sea. This shore was smooth and long, vanishing to right and left of me in extreme distances. In front swam a still immensity of sleeping ocean. At times it seemed to me that I caught a faint glimmer of light under its surface, but of this I could not be sure. Behind me rose up to an extraordinary height gaunt black cliffs. Overhead the sky was of a uniform cold gray color, the whole place being lit by a stupendous globe of pale fire that swam a little above the far horizon and shed a foam-like light above the quiet waters. Beyond the gentle murmur of the sea an intense stillness prevailed. For a long while I stayed there, looking out across its strangeness. Then, as I stared, it seemed that a bubble of white foam floated up out of the depths. And then, even now I know not how it was, I was looking upon, nay, looking into the face of her, aye, into her face, into her soul, and she looked back at me with such a commingling of joy and sadness that I ran toward her blindly, crying strangely to her, in a very agony of remembrance, of terror, and of hope, to come to me. Yet, in spite of my crying, she stayed out there upon the sea, and only shook her head sorrowfully, but in her eyes was the old earth-light of tenderness that I had come to know before all things, ere we were parted. At her perverseness I grew desperate, and essayed to wade out to her, yet, though I would, I could not. Some invisible barrier held me back, and I was fain to stay where I was, and cry out to her in the fullness of my soul, "Oh, my darling!" but could say no more for very intensity. And at that she came over swiftly and touched me, and it was as though heaven had opened. Yet when I reached out my hands to her, she put me from her with tenderly stern hands, and I was abashed. The following are legible portions of the mutilated leaves. Through tears, noise of eternity, my ears we parted. She whom I love, oh my God! I was a great time dazed, and then I was alone in the blackness of the night. I knew that I journeyed back once more to the known universe. Presently I emerged from that enormous blackness. I had come among the stars, vast time, the sun far and remote. I entered into the gulf that separates our systems from the outer suns. As I sped across the dividing dark, I watched steadily the ever-growing brightness and the size of our sun. Once I glanced back up to the stars and saw them shift, as it were, in my wake. against the mighty background of night, so vast was the speed of my passing spirit. I drew nigher to our system, and now I could see the shine of Jupiter. Later I distinguished the cold blue gleam of the earth light. I had a moment of bewilderment. All about the sun there seemed to be bright objects moving in rapid orbits. Inward, nigh to the savage glory of the sun, there circled two darting points of light, and further off there flew a blue shining speck that I knew to be the earth. It circled the sun in a space that seemed to be no more than an earth minute. Nearer with great speed, I saw the radiances of Jupiter and Saturn spinning with incredible swiftness in huge orbits. And ever I drew more nigh and looked out upon the strange sight, the visible circling of the planets about the mother sun. It was as though time had been annihilated for me, so that a year was no more to my unfleshed spirit than is a moment to an earthbound soul. The speed of the planets appeared to increase, and presently I was watching the sun, all ringed about with hair-like circles of different colored fire, the paths of the planets hurtling at mighty speed about the central flame. The sun grew vast, as though it leapt to meet me, and now I was within the circling of the outer planets, and flitting swiftly toward the place where the earth, glimmering through the blue splendor of its orbit, as though a fiery mist, circled the sun at a monstrous speed. Chapter 15. The Noise in the Night. And now I come to the strangest of all the strange happenings that have befallen me in this house of mysteries. It occurred quite lately, within the month, and I have little doubt that what I saw was in reality the end of all things. However, to my story. I do not know how it is, but up to the present I have never been able to write these things down, directly they happened. It is as though I have to wait a time, recovering my just balance, and digesting, as it were, the things I have heard and seen. No doubt this is as it should be, for by waiting I see the incidents more truly, and write of them in a calmer and more judicial frame of mind. This by the way. It is now the end of November. My story relates to what happened in the first week of the month. It was night, about 11 o'clock. Pepper and I kept one another company in the study, that great old room of mine, where I read and work. I was reading, curiously enough, the Bible. I have begun, in these later days, to take a growing interest in that great and ancient book. Suddenly a distinct tremor shook the house, and there came a faint and distant whirling buzz that grew rapidly into a far, muffled screaming. It reminded me, in a queer, gigantic way, of the noise that a clock makes when the catch is released and it is allowed to run down. The noise appeared to come from some remote height, somewhere up in the night. There was no repetition of the shock. I looked across at Pepper. He was sleeping peacefully. Gradually the whirring noise decreased, and there came a long silence. All at once a glow lit up the end window, which protrudes far out from one side of the house, so that from it one may look both east and west. I felt puzzled, and after a moment's hesitation walked across the room and pulled up the blind. As I did so, I saw the sun rise from beneath the horizon. It rose with a steady, perceptible movement. I could see it travel upward. In a minute, it seemed, it had reached the tops of the trees through which I had watched it. Up, up. It was broad daylight now. Behind me, I was conscious of a sharp, mosquito-like buzzing. I glanced round and knew that it came from the clock. Even as I looked, it marked off an hour. The minute hand was moving round the dial, faster than an ordinary second hand. The hour hand moved quickly from space to space. I had a numb sense of astonishment. A moment later, so it seemed, the two candles went out almost together. I turned swiftly back to the window, for I had seen the shadow of the window frames traveling along the floor toward me, as though a great lamp had been carried up past the window. I saw now that the sun had risen high into the heavens and was still visibly moving. It passed above the house with an extraordinary sailing kind of motion. As the window came into shadow, I saw another extraordinary thing. The fine weather clouds were not passing easily across the sky. They were scampering, as though 100-mile-an-hour wind blew. As they passed, they changed their shapes 1,000 times a minute, as though writhing with a strange life, and so were gone. And presently others came and whisked away likewise. To the west I saw the sun drop with an incredible, smooth, swift motion. Eastward the shadows of every seen thing crept toward the coming grayness, and the movement of the shadows was visible to me, a stealthy, writhing creep of the shadows of the wind-stirred trees. It was a strange sight. Quickly the room began to darken. The sun slid down to the horizon and seemed, as it were, to disappear from my sight, almost with a jerk. Through the grayness of the swift evening I saw the silver crescent of the moon falling out of the southern sky toward the west. The evening seemed to merge into an almost instant night. Above me the many constellations passed in a strange, noiseless circling. Westward, the moon fell through that last 1,000 fathoms of the night gulf, and there was only the starlight. Around this time the buzzing in the corner ceased, telling me that the clock had run down. A few minutes passed, and I saw the eastward sky lighten. A gray, sullen morning spread through all the darkness and hid the march of the stars. Overhead there moved, with a heavy, everlasting rolling, a vast, seamless sky of gray clouds, a cloud sky that would have seemed motionless through all the length of an ordinary Earth day. The sun was hidden from me, but from moment to moment the world would brighten and darken, beneath waves of subtle light and shadow. The light shifted ever westward, and the night fell upon the earth. A vast rain seemed to come with it, and a wind of a most extraordinary loudness, as though the howling of a night-long gale were packed into the space of no more than a minute. This noise passed almost immediately, and the clouds broke so that once more I could see the sky. The stars were flying westward with astounding speed. It came to me now for the first time that, though the noise of the wind had passed, yet a constant blurred sound was in my ears. Now that I noticed it, I was aware that it had been with me all the time. It was the world noise. And then, even as I grasped at so much comprehension, there came the eastward light. No more than a few heartbeats, and the sun rose swiftly. Through the trees I saw it, and then it was above the trees. Up it soared, and all the world was light. It passed with a swift, steady swing to its highest altitude and fell thence westward. I saw the day roll visibly over my head. A few light clouds flittered northward and vanished. The sun went down with one swift, clear plunge, and there was about me, for a few seconds, the darker growing gray of the gloaming. Southward and westward the moon was sinking rapidly. The night had come already. A minute it seemed, and the moon fell those remaining fathoms of dark sky. Another minute or so, and the eastward sky glowed with the coming dawn. The sun leapt upon me with a frightening abruptness, and soared ever more swiftly toward the zenith. Then suddenly a fresh thing came into my mind. A black thundercloud rushed up out of the south, and seemed to leap all the arc of the sky in a single instant. As it came, I saw that its advancing edge flapped, like a monstrous black cloth in the heaven, twirling and undulating rapidly with a horrid suggestiveness. In an instant all the air was full of rain, and 100 lightning flashes seemed to flood downward, as if it were in one great shower. In the same second of time the world noise was drowned in the roar of the wind, and then my ears ached under the stunning impact of the thunder. And in the midst of the storm, the night came, and then, within the space of another minute, the storm had passed, and there was only the constant blur of the world noise on my hearing. Overhead the stars were sliding quickly westward, and something, mayhaps the particular speed to which they had attained, brought home to me for the first time a keen realization of the knowledge that it was the world that revolved. I seemed to see suddenly the world, a vast, dark mass, revolving visibly against the stars. The dawn and the sun seemed to come together, so greatly had the speed of the world revolution increased. The sun drove up in one long, steady curve past its highest point and swept down into the western sky and disappeared. I was scarcely conscious of evening, so brief was it. Then I was watching the flying constellations and the westward hastening moon. In but a space of seconds, so it seemed, it was sliding swiftly downward through the night blue, and then was gone. And almost directly came the morning. And now there seemed to come a strange acceleration. The sun made one clean, clear sweep through the sky and disappeared behind the westward horizon, and the night came and went with a like haste. As the succeeding day opened and closed upon the world, I was aware of a sweat of snow suddenly upon the earth. The night came, and almost immediately the day. In the brief leap of the sun I saw that the snow had vanished, and then once more it was night. Thus matters were, and, even after the many incredible things that I have seen, I experienced all the time a most profound awe. To see the sun rise and set within the space of time to be measured by seconds. To watch, after a little, the moon leap, a pale and ever-growing orb, up into the night sky and glide with a strange swiftness through the vast arc of blue, and presently to see the sun follow, springing out of the eastern sky, as though in chase, and then again the night, with the swift and ghostly passing of starry constellations, was all too much to view believingly. Yet, so it was, the day slipping from dawn to dusk, and the night sliding swiftly into day, ever rapidly and more rapidly. The last three passages of the sun had shown me a snow covered earth, which at night had seemed for a few seconds incredibly weird under the fast shifting light of the soaring and falling moon. Now, however, for a little space the sky was hidden by a sea of swaying leaden white clouds, which lightened and blackened alternately with the passage of day and night. The clouds rippled and vanished, and there was once more before me a vision of the swiftly leaping sun, and nights that came and went like shadows. Faster and faster spun the world, and now each day and night was completed within the space of but a few seconds, and still the speed increased. It was a little later that I noticed the sun had begun to have the suspicion of a trail of fire behind it. This was due evidently to the speed at which it apparently traversed the heavens. And, as the days sped, each one quicker than the last, the sun began to assume the appearance of a vast flaming comet, flaring across the sky at short periodic intervals. At night the moon presented, with much greater truth, a comet-like aspect, a pale and singularly clear, fast-traveling shape of fire, trailing streaks of cold flame. The stars showed now merely as fine hairs of fire against the dark. Once I turned from the window and glanced at Pepper. In the flash of a day I saw that he slept quietly, and I moved once more to my watching. The sun was now bursting up from the eastern horizon like a stupendous rocket, seeming to occupy no more than a second or two in hurling from east to west. I could no longer perceive the passage of clouds across the sky, which seemed to have darkened somewhat. The brief nights appeared to have lost the proper darkness of night, so that the hair-like fire of the flying stars showed but dimly. As the speed increased, the sun began to sway very slowly in the sky, from south to north, and then slowly from north to south. And so, amid a strange confusion of mind, the hours passed. All this while had Pepper slept. Presently, feeling lonely and distraught, I called to him softly, but he took no notice. Again I called, raising my voice slightly. Still he moved not. I walked over to where he lay and touched him with my foot to rouse him. At the action, gentle though it was, he fell to pieces. This is what happened. He literally and actually crumpled into a moldering heap of bones and dust. For the space of perhaps a minute I stared down at the shapeless heap that had once been Pepper. I stood, feeling stunned. What can have happened? I asked myself, not at once grasping the grim significance of that little hill of ash. Then, as I stirred the heap with my foot, it occurred to me that this could only happen in a great space of time. Years and years. Outside, the weaving, fluttering light held the world. Inside, I stood, trying to understand what it meant, what that little pile of dust and dry bones on the carpet meant. But I could not think coherently. I glanced round the room, and now, for the first time, noticed how dusty and old the place looked. Dust and dirt everywhere, piled in little heaps in the corners and spread about the furniture. The very carpet itself was invisible beneath a coating of the same all-pervading material. As I walked, little clouds of the stuff rose up from under my footsteps and assailed my nostrils, with a dry, bitter odor that made me wheeze huskily. Suddenly, as my glance fell again upon Pepper's remains, I stood still, and gave voice to my confusion, questioning aloud whether the years were indeed passing, whether this, which I had taken to be a form of vision, was in truth a reality. I paused. A new thought had struck me. Quickly, but with steps which for the first time I noticed tottered, I went across the room to the great pier glass and looked in. It was too covered in grime to give back any reflection, and with trembling hands I began to rub off the dirt. Presently I could see myself. The thought that had come to me was confirmed. Instead of the great hale man, who scarcely looked 50, I was looking at a bent, decrepit man, whose shoulders stooped, and whose face was wrinkled with the years of a century. The hair, which only a few short hours ago had been nearly coal black, was now silvery white. Only the eyes were bright. Gradually I traced in that ancient man a faint resemblance to myself of other days. I turned away and tottered to the window. I knew now that I was old. and the knowledge seemed to confirm my trembling walk. For a little space I stared moodily out into the blurred vista of changeful landscape. Even in that short time, a year passed, and with a petulant gesture I left the window. As I did so, I noticed that my hand shook with the palsy of old age, and a short sob choked its way through my lips. For a little while I paced tremulously between the window and the table, my gaze wandering hither and thither uneasily. How dilapidated the room was! Everywhere lay the thick dust, thick, sleepy, and black. The fender was a shape of rust. The chains that held the brass clock weights had rusted through long ago, and now the weights lay on the floor beneath, themselves two cones of verdigris. As I glanced about, it seemed to me that I could see the very furniture of the room rotting and decaying before my eyes. Nor was this fancy on my part, for all at once the bookshelf along the side wall collapsed with a cracking and rending of rotten wood, precipitating its contents upon the floor and filling the room with a smother of dusty atoms. How tired I felt! As I walked, it seemed that I could hear my dry joints creak and crack at every step. I wondered about my sister. Was she dead, as well as Pepper? All had happened so quickly and suddenly. This must be, indeed, the beginning of the end of all things. It occurred to me to go look for her, but I felt too weary. And then she had been so queer about these happenings of late. Of late! I repeated the words and laughed feebly, mirthlessly, as the realization was borne in upon me that I spoke of a time half a century gone. Half a century! It might have been twice as long. I moved slowly to the window and looked out once more across the world. I can best describe the passage of day and night at this period as a sort of gigantic, ponderous flicker. Moment by moment, the acceleration of time continued, so that at nights now I saw the moon only as a swaying trail of palish fire that varied from a mere line of light to a nebulous path, and then dwindled again, disappearing periodically. The flicker of the days and nights quickened. The days had grown perceptibly darker, and a queer quality of dusk lay, as it were, in the atmosphere. The nights were so much lighter that the stars could scarcely be seen, saving here and there an occasional hair-like line of fire that seemed to sway a little with the moon. Quicker and ever quicker ran the flicker of day and night, and suddenly it seemed I was aware that the flicker had died out, and instead there reigned a comparatively steady light that was shed upon all the world, from an eternal river of flame that swung up and down, north and south, in stupendous, mighty swings. The sky was now grown very much darker, and there was in the blue of it a heavy gloom, as though a vast blackness peered through it upon the earth. Yet there was in it also a strange and awful clearness and emptiness. Periodically I had glimpses of a ghostly track of fire that swayed thin and darkly toward the sun stream, and vanished and reappeared. It was the scarcely visible moon stream. Looking out at the landscape, I was conscious again of a blurring sort of flitter that came either from the light of the ponderous swinging sunstream, or was the result of the rapid changes of the earth's surface. And every few moments, so it seemed, the snow would lie suddenly upon the world, and vanish as abruptly as though an invisible giant flitted a white sheet on and off the earth. Time fled, and the weariness that was mine grew insupportable. I turned from the window and walked once more across the room, the heavy dust deadening the sound of my footsteps. Each step that I took seemed a greater effort than the one before. An intolerable ache knew me in every joint and limb as I trod my way with a weary uncertainty. By the opposite wall I came to a weak pause and wondered dimly what was my intent. I looked to my left and saw my old chair. The thought of sitting in it brought a faint sense of comfort to my bewildered wretchedness. Yet, because I was so weary and old and tired, I would scarcely brace my mind to do anything but stand, and wish myself those few yards. I rocked as I stood. The floor even seemed a place for rest, but the dust lay so thick and sleepy and black. I turned with a great effort of will and made toward my chair. I reached it with a groan of thankfulness. I sat down. Everything about me seemed to be growing dim. It was all so strange and unthought of. Last night I was a comparatively strong, though elderly man, and now, only a few hours later, I looked at the little dust heap that had once been Pepper. Hours! And I laughed, a feeble, bitter laugh, a shrill, cackling laugh that shocked my dimming senses. For a while I must have dozed. Then I opened my eyes with a start. Somewhere across the room there had been a muffled noise of something falling. I looked and saw vaguely a cloud of dust hovering above a pile of debris. Nearer the door, something else tumbled with a crash. It was one of the cupboards, but I was tired and took little notice. I closed my eyes and sat there in a state of drowsy semi unconsciousness. Once or twice, as though coming through thick mists, I heard noises faintly. Then I must have slept. Chapter 16. The Awakening. I woke with a start. For a moment I wondered where I was, then memory came to me. The room was still lit with that strange light, half sun, half moon light. I felt refreshed, and the tired, weary ache had left me. I went slowly across the room and looked out. Overhead, the river of flame drove up and down, north and south, in a dancing semicircle of fire. As a mighty sleigh in the loom of time, it seemed, in a sudden fancy of mine, to be beating home the picks of the years. For so vastly had the passage of time been accelerated that there was no longer any sense of the sun passing from east to west. The only apparent movement was the north and south beat of the sun stream, that had become so swift now as to be better described as a quiver. As I peered out, there came to me a sudden inconsequent memory of that last journey among the outer worlds. I remembered the sudden vision that had come to me as I neared the solar system, of the fast whirling planets about the sun, as though the governing quality of time had been held in abeyance, and the machine of a universe allowed to run down in eternity in a few moments or hours. The memory passed, along with my partially comprehended suggestion that I had been permitted a glimpse into further time streams. I stared out again, seemingly at the quake of the sun stream. The speed seemed to increase even as I looked. Several lifetimes came and went as I watched. Suddenly it struck me with a sort of grotesque seriousness that I was still alive. I thought of Pepper and wondered how it was that I had not followed his fate. He had reached the time of his dying and had passed, probably through sheer length of years. And here was I, alive, hundreds of thousands of centuries after my rightful period of years. For a time I mused absently. Yesterday, I stopped suddenly. Yesterday? There was no yesterday. The yesterday of which I spoke had been swallowed up in the abyss of years, ages gone. I grew dazed with much thinking. Presently I turned from the window and glanced round the room. It seemed different, strangely, utterly different. Then I knew what it was that made it appear so strange. It was bare. There was not a piece of furniture in the room, not even a solitary fitting of any sort. Gradually my amazement went as I remembered that this was but the inevitable end of that process of decay which I had witnessed commencing before my sleep. Thousands of years, millions of years. Over the floor was spread a deep layer of dust that reached halfway up to the window seat. It had grown immeasurably whilst I slept, and represented the dust of untold ages. Undoubtedly atoms of the old decayed furniture helped to swell its bulk, and somewhere among it all mouldered the long-dead Pepper. All at once it occurred to me that I had no recollection of wading knee-deep through all that dust after I awoke. True, an incredible age of years had passed since I approached the window, but that was evidently as nothing compared with the countless spaces of time that I conceived had vanished whilst I was sleeping. I remembered now that I had fallen asleep, sitting in my old chair. Had it gone? I glanced toward where it had stood. Of course, there was no chair to be seen. I could not satisfy myself whether it had disappeared after my waking or before. If it had mouldered under me, surely I should have been waked by the collapse. Then I remembered that the thick dust which covered the floor would have been sufficient to soften my fall, so that it was quite possible I had slept upon the dust for 1,000,000 years or more. As these thoughts wandered through my brain, I glanced again casually to where the chair had stood. Then, for the first time, I noticed that there were no marks in the dust of my footprints between it and the window. But then ages of years had passed since I had awaked, tens of thousands of years. My look rested thoughtfully again upon the place where once had stood my chair. Suddenly I passed from abstraction to intentness, for there, in its standing place, I made out a long undulation, rounded off with the heavy dust. Yet it was not so much hidden, but that I could tell what caused it. I knew, and shivered at the knowledge, that it was a human body, ages dead, lying there, beneath the place where I had slept. It was lying on its right side, its back turned toward me. I could make out and trace each curve and outline, softened and molded as it were in the black dust. In a vague sort of way, I tried to account for its presence there. Slowly, I began to grow bewildered as the thought came to me that it lay just about where I must have fallen when the chair collapsed. Gradually, an idea began to form itself within my brain, a thought that shook my spirit. It seemed hideous and insupportable, yet it grew upon me steadily until it became a conviction. The body under that coating, that shroud of dust, was neither more nor less than my own dead shell. I did not attempt to prove it. I knew it now and wondered I had not known it all along. I was a bodiless thing. A while I stood, trying to adjust my thoughts to this new problem. In time, how many thousands of years I know not, I attained to some degree of quietude, sufficient to enable me to pay attention to what was transpiring around me. Now I saw that the elongated mound had sunk, collapsed, level with the rest of the spreading dust, and fresh atoms, impalpable, had settled above that mixture of grave powder which the eons had ground. A long while I stood, turned from the window. Gradually I grew more collected, while the world slipped across the centuries into the future. Presently I began a survey of the room. Now I saw that time was beginning its destructive work, even on this strange old building. That it had stood through all the years was, it seemed to me, proof that it was something different from any other house. I do not think, somehow, that I had thought of its decaying, though why I could not have said. It was not until I had meditated upon the matter for some considerable time that I fully realized that the extraordinary space of time through which it had stood was sufficient to have utterly pulverized the very stones of which it was built, had they been taken from any earthly quarry. Yet, yes, it was undoubtedly mouldering now. All the plaster had gone from the walls, even as the woodwork of the room had gone many ages before. While I stood in contemplation, a piece of glass from one of the small diamond shaped panes dropped, with a dull tap, amid the dust upon the sill behind me, and crumpled into a little heap of powder. As I turned from contemplating it, I saw light between a couple of the stones that formed the outer wall. Evidently, the mortar was falling away. After a while I turned once more to the window and peered out. I discovered now that the speed of time had become enormous. The lateral quiver of the sunstream had grown so swift as to cause the dancing semicircle of flame to merge into and disappear in a sheet of fire that covered half the southern sky from east to west. From the sky I glanced down to the gardens. There was just a blur of a palish, dirty green. I had a feeling that they had stood higher than in the old days, a feeling that they were nearer my window, as though they had risen bodily. Yes, yet they were still a long way below me, for the rock, over the mouth of the pit on which this house stands, arches up to a great height. It was later that I noticed a change in the constant color of the gardens. The pale, dirty green was growing ever paler and paler toward white. At last, after a great space, they became grayish white, and thus stayed thus for a very long time. Finally, however, the grayness began to fade, even as had the green, into a dead white, and this remained, constant and unchanged. And by this I knew that, at last, snow lay upon all the northern world. And so, by millions of years, time winged onward through eternity to the end of which, in the old earth days, I had thought remotely, and in hazily speculative fashion. And now it was approaching in a manner of which none had ever dreamed. I recollect that, at about this time, I began to have a lively, though morbid, curiosity as to what would happen when the end came, but I seemed strangely without imaginings. All this while, the steady process of decay was continuing. The few remaining pieces of glass had long ago vanished, and every now and then a soft thud, a little cloud of rising dust, would tell of some fragment of fallen mortar or stone. I looked up again to the fiery sheet that quaked in the heavens above me and far down into the southern sky. As I looked, the impression was borne in upon me that it had lost some of its first brilliancy, that it was duller, deeper hued. I glanced down once more to the blurred white of the worldscape. Sometimes my look returned to the burning sheet of dulling flame that was, and yet hid the sun. At times I glanced behind me into the growing dusk of the great silent room, with its eon carpet of sleeping dust. So I watched through the fleeting ages, lost in soul-wearing thoughts and wonderings, and possessed with a new weariness. And that terrifying existential emptiness is where I shall leave you for this week, and we will conclude our reading in November. Just to let you know about November, because of the holidays coming up on Thursdays in November, Thanksgiving and Veterans Day, we're going to be moving chapters to Tuesdays. So our next session will be on Tuesday, November the 9th. At the same time, 7 p.m., right here on YouTube. But just remember that during November, it's going to be on Tuesdays. And then once we get to December, we're going to be returning to our usual Thursday time. So I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's reading of House on the Borderland. Be sure to go back and watch all of our past episodes, watch last week's beginning of the House on the Borderland, watch all of our old episodes, all of our animated episodes, rewatch your favorites, keep wearing your fabulous sets of horns or hats, whichever you prefer. Wear both. Go wild. And I will see you all in just under 2 weeks' time on Tuesday, November the 9th, right here on YouTube. Have a good night. Bye.